The power of music, that there's something about the human brain. We make these connections more strongly to music and people who produce it than some other art forms.
You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolske.
And I'm Rudy Salo.
And this is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, all with the aim of a happy life, a more knowledgeable life, a life where we're using our critical thinking skills. And today we have returning guests. Okay, so Rudy, this was a mistake that we made. Well, I should say that I'm going to take the ownership for this one. But we were thinking, hey, maybe we should make our episodes a little bit shorter. And our first trial run was on punk rock. And what happened? Everybody got back to us and was saying, hey, look, we loved that episode on punk rock, but it was way too short. So we get to make up for that this time around because we have Josh Heter, Richard Greene, philosophy professors, editors of a fantastic book, Post-Punk Rock. So we did punk rock with them. We did The Godfather with them. Now we're talking about post-punk rock, and it is not a short episode. We've got all the details in this one.
Yeah, including details as to what the hell is post-punk, which I think is an important thing for people to understand. Basically, whether or not you're into punk rock, you could just set that aside. The reality is the vast majority of people do like some kind of post-punk band, because the catalog of bands that fills under that umbrella is very, very, very wide. And you've definitely heard of these bands, and you probably definitely like a lot of these bands. From the get-go in the episode, we get into an explanation of what we're actually talking about as opposed to punk rock, what is post-punk. We do talk a fair amount about some philosophical teachings that we can learn from the music, philosophical teachings that we can learn from music in general. What I liked about this episode is we also just discuss why music is an important subject for philosophers to discuss, for people to discuss, for politicians to discuss, how relevant it is in our society today.
Yeah. Similar to when we've talked about theater and comedy, it's a reflection of a free society. So it can reflect our culture, it can criticize our culture, and then the way in which that comes across is interesting because we are also trying to define the parameters of what constitutes post-punk rock. And so it was also, I just like the essays that they put together because it's making me think more about the philosophers. I think on your end, it's making you think more about the music. And it's just really cool how Rich and Josh are bringing this to the public, engaging the public in thinking deeply, thinking critically about the stuff that they already love. And that's why we have them back and we just enjoy them so much and we want everyone to get their books. Quick question. The Cure was mentioned in the book and I would have never thought of them as post-punk rock. But the other day I was listening to my playlist and Dinosaur Jr. came on and they did a cover of The Cure of Just Like Heaven. And it's so cool. So is Dinosaur Jr. post-punk rock?
Yeah, I think it would fall under that a very, very wide umbrella. Dinosaur Jr. was on SST Records. SST Records was actually started by one of the members of Black Flag. The answer is yes, because like I said, it's a very wide umbrella. We even talk about how My Chemical Romance has fallen underneath that umbrella, though most people kind of take issue of that. Basically, post-punk is just another way of saying alternative rock. But alternative really didn't get going until the 90s. So if you're talking about like 70s and 80s alternative rock, that's post-punk.
Okay. So Rich and Josh, this is what you did to me. So I'm driving and I'm listening to my playlist and wondering, does this fit that category or not? What about Radiohead? Does Radiohead fit?
Nah, no.
No? Okay. See, we're learning every day. Okay, so let's get started. We are talking about post-punk rock with Richard Greene and Josh Heter. Okay, so Richard and Josh, I think you need to get a cut from all of the music that people are going to be revisiting and listening to because of your books. Because I found myself when I was reading the essays going back to listening to some of the bands that were mentioned, like My Chemical Romance and Joy Division, and thinking, oh, wow, like they're getting more clicks. And why? Because I'm reading your book and trying to figure out what the philosophical connection is.
Mm-hmm. Nice. I support that proposal. And my experience was very similar, right? As we're working through the book, I'm like, oh, I haven't heard that in a decade. And I'm popping it on and then I listen for a while and come back and sort of fell back in love with a whole bunch of artists and bands that were just otherwise just kind of on the shelf for me.
Yeah, I actually did the same thing, in preparation for the book. There are a couple of tasks putting together one of these books that are a little mindless, like sending out the call for abstracts. And I was like, I'm going to put on a post-punk playlist, and it really got me in the mood to get excited about the book. And I'll also take the check as well.
Yeah.
I think and thanks again for coming on the show again, guys. We are huge fans of yours. You guys, I think, are the gurus of pop culture philosophy. The books that you put out, the stuff that you guys talk about, it's amazing. The last time we had you on, we talked about the philosophy of punk rock. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're talking about the philosophy of post-punk. And for most people out there, I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say most people don't even know what the hell the difference is between the two. I do, because I'm a music nerd and I'm obsessed with both punk rock and post-punk. Could you guys give a very simple explanation of what we're talking about when we talk about post-punk as opposed to punk rock?
Well, for some of my, less enlightened friends, like, you're doing a book on what? And I was all the weird music from the 80s. That's what it is. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, so I guess I'm not a historian, although I'm a fan of history. And, all the historians of popular culture I read seem to make the case that, towards the end of the 70s, like 77, the big punk movement came in strong and it went out just as quickly. It sort of fizzled out. It sort of had its moment and then it was gone. It sort of left this door open for something that was punk-like, but, not as in your face, a little bit more subdued, a little bit more eclectic. That's what emerged, right? Post-punk, all these bands that they didn't quite leave everything punk behind, but they weren't as angry. Their songs weren't as furious and fast and quick, and a little bit more thoughtful in their lyrics sometimes. And so all the bands, even Joy Division, Talking Heads, all those good people. And a lot of interesting stuff came out the decade after that, late 70s and the 80s. And we've had a couple of revivals, right? Bands that are post-punk revival bands in the 90s, and then again in the early 2000s, and like the 2000s, like the Strokes and Arctic Monkeys, the Tokyo Police Club. Just a lot of weird, cool music that came out of people sort of waking up from the furious hangover that punk gave them.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that as well. So, when I talk to people about this book, they took the title very literally, right? And they think post-punk is just everything, or maybe everything all that comes after punk, right? And there's sort of a misconception there, because some of the post-punk stuff is starting kind of in the middle of the punk rock movement, Talking Heads in 77 and so forth. There's that misconception. There's this idea that whatever's alt and is not punk must be new wave. And I think there's plenty of new wave acts that are sort of in the punky tradition, but you wouldn't want to think of them as post-punk, right? Bands like Laughing Dogs. They're doing a sort of distinct kind of thing. For me, part of what I think about it is punk, we talk about this in the punk book, is in a lot of ways about authenticity, but that authenticity gets sort of very constrained. It's not just being your authentic self, but it's this sort of rigid set of rules that constitute what's real punk and so forth. And I think a lot of acts around that time, especially maybe, Joy Division with Ian Curtis, sort of like the punk sensibility, but they're being their authentic self, was doing something maybe more musically ambitious, more musically melodic, expressing a wider range of emotions, where punk really was just kind of we're angry and sometimes we're angry and we're not going to take it kind of thing. Bands like the Smiths and other ones, The Cure, paradigmatic post-punk bands. I think they wanted to say more things about themselves, their inner lives, their experience, what it's like to be, that sort of person, maybe disenfranchised or some such, and do it in more creative ways than quote unquote authentic punk would allow for.
I think that's a great segue into my next question. And I know Gwen's also interested in this question. It seems that emotions and feeling emotions, in particular resentment or melancholy, this feeling of kind of being down a little bit, is pervasive in post-punk, whereas in punk, the pervasive emotion is anger, right?
Yeah.
Everyone can accept that. That's not controversial in any way, shape, or form. Whereas with post-punk, with the music being even more eccentric, more, it's beyond the three chords and the snare drums and the pulsing bass guitar. It's a lot more of an expansive musical genre. Therefore, you can have even more emotions, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of how I'm viewing everything there. It's probably a little bit simplistic, but I think it's probably a good way of it. So I got to ask, because I asked this question about punk rock, and I asked about punk rock being, how would the Stoics feel about punk? How would the Stoics feel about that anger? And the decision was, well, if it's righteous anger, it's okay. I would almost even say, again, is it that post-punk, owns the despair. It says it's okay to feel these feelings. It's okay to feel these emotions. And if so, could one say that post-punk is even more stoic than punk? Or is the fact that it oozes emotion mean that it is the antithesis of stoicism? And I'm not trying to say that stoicism says you're not allowed to feel your feelings. I guess I'm always struggling with what is stoicism, and I'm trying to match it to music. And so here I'm trying to compare the two. Punk, what's more stoic, punk or post-punk?
Yeah, good. So, for the question you asked just sort of before the what's more stoic question, right? Is post-punk more stoic or not stoic? I really think it's both. I think you get a large group of people that are just as unstoic as could be. Emotions, Morrissey just splattered all over the place and no intent to suppress them or keep them down. And then you get this sort of stoical group of post-punks that, in virtue of their emotions, which they acknowledge, they have this sort of disenfranchised, I'm not going to do much of anything. I feel terrible, therefore I'm checking out kind of thing. So I think you see both elements. Punk does not come off as very stoical to me in comparison to post-punk, but maybe I'll let Josh weigh in.
Yeah, my inclination is to say post-punk is much more stoic in its nature. When I think of punk rock, at least in the first wave punk rock, which is, what we often like, the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, Generation X, all these people, it seems like anger and resentment, those are big themes. And the bands really want you to know it, right? They're angry and we want you to know it. In post-punk, the wider breadth of emotions, yes, there are emotions, as we talked about in post-punk. The feel I always get when I listen to post-punk is like there's like almost like it's a form of detachment that the artist has to their emotion. Like, this is the way things are, and I'm going to sing about it. But, they've come to terms with it. They've come to terms with their despair, and they're very matter-of-fact about it. And there's something stoic about that. Just not getting rid of your emotions necessarily, but, yeah, just coming to grips with them and the way things are, and that's how it's got to be.
One of the essays that really caught my attention on that was the essay Post-Punk Music You're Seeing by Frunze. Is that
Mahela Frunze.
Yes. What caught my attention was this paradigm shift that is being discussed in that essay that evolved from the anger to, let's say, thinkers like Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks to a sense of empowerment and transformation. I thought that was really, really interesting. And it was also, this band isn't mentioned in the book, but it did make me think about Oingo Boingo, and their first album in the 70s has that kind of that punk rock feel, the Only a Lad, like this anger. And when you look at their music later in the 90s, how they evolved to kind of this sound that's, Danny Elfman is totally unique, so it's hard to compare him to anybody, but the sound was still critical. Like, there was some uplifting fun stuff like Halloween shows, but then also when they got political, they were very critical. But the sound is radically different from coming out of that punk rock era from the 70s to the 90s. And yeah, that's my contribution. I was just thinking about that paradigm shift. I'm like, oh, I can trace that through their albums.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like the evolution from punk to post-punk, if we were to treat it as like one big thing, it's parallel to, I think, the maturation that a lot of people go through, certainly young men. When I was younger, I listened to a lot of punk. I liked my songs fast and quick. And yeah, as I got older, I matured and my tastes matured, and I liked more nuance, and I like a lot of different types of things. And something similar happened like with punk and post-punk, right? The punks matured and they realized there's more than three chords and there's more to sing about than anger. I think the progression from punk to post-punk is almost quite literally a maturation.
I would agree with what Josh said, and then maybe just sort of add a little bit to it. To me, at that time, as I was just in the punk rock scene and just loved it to death. But I remember I was in bands as a songwriter, feeling sort of very strongly this thing about authenticity I talked about earlier, where it was being prescribed to me what counted as acceptable. And I can imagine a lot of early post-punk bands confronted this and thought, why am I going to let this group of angry people tell me what I can and can't do? So suddenly you start seeing like synthesizers in music just because they were taboo in the punk scene, right? Part of it's a maturation process, but part of it is a response to punk. I've got all the same problems that the punks have. I'm angry at the government too. I'm angry at our politicians. If I'm in the UK, I'm mad at Margaret Thatcher. If I'm in the United States, I'm mad at Ronald Reagan. But I would prefer to express that in different and more sophisticated ways.
Something I really like about your book that I've been thinking about is that it appeals to, let's say, the layperson or somebody outside of academia, to their nostalgia about the music and to think more about the music. And then for me, as somebody who studied philosophy, I'm looking at these connections and it's making me want to return to the philosophers. So there was another essay by Casey, is it Ken Meester? Art will tear art apart again. And the discussion about Hegel, which I confess, I have not read Hegel in a long time because it's so hard. But because this essay is using Hegel to talk about the shift of ideas and how they're building on each other, it's making me want to, as a philosopher, go back and take a look at Hegel's work. Like, that's what's inspired me. There's this quote in there that says, for Hegel, if music doesn't have the spiritual content and expression, then it fails to be a genuine art. And that is made me rethink about what music we really latch onto. Like, why are there some songs that are fads, and why are there some songs that years, decades later, we still play and we want to play over and over again? And it's probably because they have that character that Hegel expressed in his aesthetics. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a sense in which, a very Hegelian sense, in which post-punk kind of saves punk. Casey, he's spot on in this paper. He just tells the standard story. You've got this sort of thesis. It's the music of the day, and his representative band is Eagles. And then in strong antithesis to that, you get, just the polar opposite, which is punk rock. And then a synthesis comes out of that. And he's suggesting that synthesis is post-punk. And I think that's right. Had it not gone that way, I think punk would have been much more of a flash in the pan rather than something that, you now have second, third, and fourth waves, etc. Punk endures, and I think post-punk, to a maybe slightly lesser extent, endures. But in part, because of the post-punk synthesis of punk and the music that came right before it. The Hegelian story is great for the synthesis, but it also turned out to be very good for the antithesis.
Yeah, if I can piggyback on that, as much as I love punk, both the first wave stuff and even stuff beyond that, you can sort of get in the mode of thought that you see punk as like an overcorrection to a lot of the music of the day in the early 70s and the mid 70s. How a lot of it was just meant to be pleasant and very broad and kind of, shallow. And, we all have our guilty pleasures, but that was the predominant sort of feel of a lot of the music. And so punk comes in to do, like Richard said, the polar opposite. And eventually it was like, okay, maybe the pendulum doesn't need to swing that far. Maybe we can bring it back somewhere in the middle here for the synthesis.
I have a naive question. I'm really show my ignorance with this. But in our last episode with you on punk rock, there was a discussion about this problematic tangential issue with white supremacy and neo-Nazis and stuff like that. Is that eradicated in post-punk rock?
I think for the most part, it's, that post-punk isn't that attractive to those groups, but you get something kind of like it over time, right? A lot of the early heroes of post-punk have now sort of become just kind of nasty conservative voices, and in some cases pretty either racist or misogynistic. As they age, they're embarrassing themselves. But yeah, I don't. Josh, correct me if you think I'm wrong about this. You might know the history a little better than I do. But I don't see this sort of ugly element in the early, the first decade or the 75 to 87, whatever it was.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Post-punk.
What is the variable that changed, that got rid of that tangential issue? What changed?
It sounds like an oversimplification, but it's the lack of anger, right? Or it's not, anger isn't, I'm not a fan of this word, but anger isn't centralized, right? Anger isn't at the forefront of the music, of the movement. And that's really probably a lot of part of the draw for those groups. That was an outlet for them to spew hate, to be angry about whatever they're angry about. And those as Richard sort of alludes, those types of folks aren't prone to the reflectiveness that post-punk is a little bit more leans into.
And a lot of post-punk, I think, was really LGBTQ friendly at the time. And, those were nice spaces for people. And the stupid Nazi punks don't like that scene generally.
That's interesting. Okay. This is a question I have for Rudy. Rudy, when we did our last episode on punk rock, you were quite, I don't know what the word is to describe. Let's just say reactionary to Sting being mentioned. So I'm wondering if in this collection, were there any bands or anyone that was mentioned that drew that same kind of ire from you or thought differently about?
It's a great question.
Thank you.
And the answer is no. And but here's the reason why, right? So as we've been reading these essays and these books, both on the philosophy of punk rock as well as the philosophy of post-punk, I feel like my education of punk rock has expanded by thousands upon thousands of percentage points, which is ridiculous because we can't really go over 100%. But I'm trying to make a point here. I actually have a completely different view of punk rock now. And that's because it is constrained. To be a true punk, you got to stay within this box, okay? There's a box. It's the punk rock box.
Mm-hmm.
And Sting, one point in time, the point of that essay was in that box. And then he said, forget it. I'm not going to conform, right? I'm not going to conform to your judgments or your box checking. I'm going to be who I am. And in a way, the point of that essay was, well, Sting is truly more punk rock than punk rockers like to say he is, because he bucked the norm of conformity of punk rock.
Yeah.
For post-punk, my opinion, and please somebody correct me if I'm wrong, is it's a box, it's a post-punk box in that you got to talk about some kind of despair and some kind of emotion. You got to talk about feelings. Other than that, the box is huge. And you could put all different kinds of bands in that box. Dare you even say that actually the band Television, which was around in the mid-70s, are they really punk rock or are they really post-punk? Well, how could they be post-punk if they were there when punk rock first came out? You can get in these crazy arguments of trying to slot bands into these boxes and, lose your mind. At the end of the day, I don't think I could get offended by any band being called post-punk. I think that would be an impossibility because the box is so huge for post-punk. That's my response. I don't know if there's any reactions to that.
What are the parameters as far as the category? Because I like what Rudy's saying, like the box is so big, but there has to be some border there. So what are the parameters between post-punk rock and then, no, this is not post-punk rock?
Right. So here's how I think of it. Josh might have a different take.
No, I'm letting Richard answer this one because this is a tough question.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the way I've always conceptualized it, and this might not map perfectly onto every band in the genre, and I might just be out of my mind on this. But what I thought is if there were bands around that time that wanted to retain significant, and this is really vague, but significant punk sensibilities, and yet go in different directions and not be constrained by the 3-chord angry kind of thing, then they're post-punk. Somebody like Elvis Costello, who's, his early work is not particularly emotional other than the sort of angry guy that he was. But musically, he's dabbling with genres and all that. And I think he fits nicely in post-punk, but is not particularly emo. So what is it got? Well, I know something about the guitars on the first couple of albums sound kind of punky, and the songs are 2-minute, 50-second songs, generally speaking. And he dresses like some of the people at the punk shows. So he's in the club. Then you get a band like the Smiths, or maybe The Cure's a better example. They don't look anything like Elvis Costello. They're really goth and so forth. They are very emo, but their music sounds sort of less punk derivative than, say, maybe Costello's. And yet there's some kind of attitude or something in there that lets them in the tent. So really, it's taking something from punk around that time, retaining part of the sensibility, maybe identifying. Forenza talks about belonging in her essay, right? Somehow belonging to that larger group, but not being constrained in punk ways.
Yeah, absolutely. To answer the question you posed to Rudy, I'll give you a band that stuck out to me.
Okay.
It's actually in Forenza's a really great chapter. When I first read the abstract, I think I was like, My Chemical Romance. I was like, that my gut reaction was like, is that really post-punk? Number one, that's me being nitpicky, even for a philosopher. But also, it just illustrates the point that she's making in the question that she's raising in her essay about what do we mean by belonging when we talk about you feel like you belong to a genre of music. Because the people who are fans of My Chemical Romance, which, I would now think of under the post-punk umbrella, they do feel a sense of belonging to that band and to the whole sort of genre, subgenre. That did stick out to me, but I think I've been persuaded.
Yeah. So something I would really like to know from both of you, then, in this process of reading the abstracts and putting the book together, I know for a lot of people, they'll read the essays and then they'll think differently about the music. But for you as philosophers, was there any essay that made you think differently about the philosopher? Like, oh, I didn't know it could be applied that way, or I hadn't viewed this theory in that way. I mean, you're getting me to read Hegel. Do you understand? Do you understand what you've done to me? I'm going to be like on energy drinks.
Well, first of all, we apologize.
Yeah, no, I don't read Hegel. That generally doesn't happen to me when I'm doing editorial work, unless it's a philosopher that I'm not very familiar with. If it's making me think about him differently, I almost always end up concluding that the author's getting the philosopher wrong. But yeah, I don't know that there were particular instances like Casey Brentmeester's paper. I mean, that's a sort of textbook Hegel. I thought he had that perfectly. He also talks about the doctrine of eternal recurrence, and he had that right as well.
I mean, I would point to that same essay as well about Hegel, because like when I read the minimum amount of Hegel that I had to get through grad school, and I still think I get it. But yeah, I'm thinking about.
I want that on my tombstone.
Thesis, thesis. Thinking about the synthesis, just in a slightly different light. Maybe revisit that, and I don't know if I think differently about it, but maybe appreciating it for the first time or a little bit more, certainly.
Yeah, I think I like that with the essay mentioning Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks, because I'm telling you, like, as I'm sitting down to write the essay, and when those names are thrown into the mix, I would have never guessed that if I'm going to read an essay on post-punk rock, that those names would have come into the picture. And because they did, now I'm looking at their work and seeing the relationship or the shift from anger to empowerment and transformation. So now I'm looking at their work through that lens, like highlighting that theme more.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So I'm often surprised at the philosophers that come up in the book. So maybe that's a similar experience to what you're having, right? So Kierkegaard gets mentioned, and I hadn't thought of him in connection with post-punk. My wife and I joke about him. We call him Little Emo Kierkegaard. And then I'm sort of surprised I hadn't made the connection. So you see it in the book and you go, oh, yeah. In that sense, you're right, Gwen. It kind of adds to the understanding of the philosopher. Some of these are sort of natural topics for certain philosophers. And we did the Godfather book and got, at least 30% submissions on Machiavelli. Our response is, well, of course, right? It's almost what we anticipated. You're bound to get, some Aristotle on art and so forth if you do a book, on some topic in aesthetics, especially music genres. But yeah, I am surprised sometimes at which philosophers get connected in.
And I think we brought this up maybe last time. That is one of the more fun things about putting one of these books together is when those submissions do come in that give you the light bulb moment. It's like, oh, how did I not think of that? I'm like, that's a great, I hadn't thought of that, but it's great. There are those connections that you miss.
And so this brings me to, I think, a question in aesthetics. Then what is the distinction between the art and the artist? The artist puts this out, and then we all have this opportunity to analyze it. And if the artist, that wasn't their intention or what they hadn't thought of, like, what is the connection between the art and the artist? What is a fair way to analyze their work? How much do we take into consideration the artist as opposed to the art?
I'm a big fan of not taking the artist into consideration much. We've talked about this a lot at various of our ethics discussions because you find out something about an artist later, and does that ruin the art for you? But I like Costello's line on this, right? So Elvis Costello talks about, he writes these things, then he looks and sees all the interpretations, and he says, oh, they're almost never what he had in mind, right? His stuff is sort of sufficiently cryptic. But then he takes it that's what the songs are about, right? So he creates this thing, and what they are about is what people take them to be about. So I like this song by the Talking Heads because it makes me think of this, or it makes me feel this way, or it motivated this line of thought. Well, the song did that. That song has that power, regardless of whether David Byrne was thinking anything along those lines or not.
And I tend to be, or at least I have the tendency to be in the complete opposite direction. I am a authorial intent person. On the other hand, I'm also on board with Richard. Like, if I took that 100% seriously, that would make for like boring art or boring art world. And I want there to be mystery even for the artist. I have tendencies towards authorial intent, like that's what it means, but I'm definitely not fully on board with it either.
We've got a lot of musicians in the news lately.
Oh, let's not even go there.
Well,
The
I mean,
news is just
I'm going to mention
way
that the
way too
Tamer
P
ridiculous.
Diddy
run,
falls squarely outside of post
Foo
punk. That I'm sure.
Yeah,
Fighters.
P Diddy is
We're
not
not going to talk about P.
not
Diddy.
We're not going to do P Diddy and philosophy anytime soon. I don't think.
no.
Yeah.
I would please let's stay away from that third rail.
We'll leave that. I'm just saying, no. Okay. Well, Foo Fighters. Okay, that's a little bit
No,
tamer.
that's not. Nope,
No.
nope.
Okay.
They're
What
not.
about I Hate
They are
Taylor
definitely
Swift?
not post punk,
No.
and we're not talking about that either.
Well, I mean, my interest is that it's with collections of essays like this where we get to do a deep dive, then it really helps me kind of crystallize the significance of music and its message and the art with our concept of the way that society is structured, what is political, what is critical, like all of these things, as we can see in the news, like whether it comes from criminality or for being a criminal to having extramarital affairs. And then, the candidate for the United States says that he hates Taylor Swift. Like all of these things really show us that music isn't just some sub thing like that's on the side. It's totally interwoven in our ideas of right and wrong.
Yeah, no, that's right. Music is at the forefront of pop culture, right? Maybe music, television, and film. And if you're an artist working in other genres, you may not have sort of any influence whatsoever or very little influence on people's moral lives, whether that's guiding their moral views or affecting their behavior. But yeah, we obsess over pop culture, musicians and their art as well as them as artists. I mean, I saw 20 stories this week about Selena Gomez is now officially a billionaire, right? That's sort of the last thing I could imagine anybody caring about.
Mhm.
But, she's a singer and an actress, and oh my God, she's a billionaire. And that was headline news on one of the pages I go to.
It just speaks to the power of music that there's something about the human brain. We make these connections more strongly to music and people who produce it than some other art forms. Yeah, and plenty of ink spilled on that topic from both philosophers and psychologists. And we feel these immense connections to these people who create this particular type of art.
Yeah, there was an interview that I saw recently of a psychologist, and I can't remember the interview and I can't remember the psychologist, but the question was, how can we create dopamine? And his answer was listening to music. I thought that was interesting. I'm sorry, Rudy, I cut you off. What were you going to say?
Actually, I love that you brought this up. Not the way you brought it up with P Diddy and Foo Fighters with the controversy. I think it.
Okay,
it's
all
very
right,
controversial. Very controversial.
Hold on, Rudy. Let me ask you, are you bothered that Selena's a billionaire? Because that's a nice story, right?
Well, bothered.
She's funny on TV and she's loaded. And
I'm glad you brought that up. Am I bothered by that? Absolutely not, because I'm sure she had to work her ass off for that. And I would never think ill of anybody who had to, amazing combination of both talent, hard work, luck for them to become a billionaire. God bless her. That's great. I mean, couldn't be happier for her. And I think that should be the attitude of everybody. What I liked about Gwen's line of questioning is, I think what she was saying was, okay, all right, everybody. Yes, we are doing another episode about the philosophy of music. Okay, yeah. But here's why. It's because music is so important to human happiness. It's so important to pop culture. It's so important in politics. It's so important in everything that we can't just dismiss these episodes as just, oh, that's just so cute. It's the philosophy of punk rock. It's the philosophy of post-punk. No, this is legitimate stuff. What do people spend a lot of their days doing when they're not listening to Good as in the Details podcast or other podcasts?
Nice.
They are listening to music. They are going to concerts. They are watching music videos on YouTube or something. Music is a part of our life. It's the fact that we're honoring music by having these discussions is important, in my opinion.
No, I agree. And there's something interesting about students now, college students, and my son is one, and people his age. They're not particularly interested in entertainment that takes too long to access. So I'll say, have you watched this series or these movies? And they don't. They like the 3-second to 20-second TikTok reel, just something coming at them very quickly, one after another. They get bored extremely quickly. And yet they will sit and listen to song after song. These 3-minute pieces to 5-minute pieces are 10 to 20 times as long as their normal entertainment. My son, who's on Instagram Reels and TikTok quite a bit, will listen to music for hours, and that's I think a real testament to music that it sort of breaks that super short attention span mold still for kids.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we do reflections about this, about the emotions, about the history of certain boxes, as you would call them, the box of punk rock, the box of post-punk, and what does it mean? I think these essays are fantastic, and this is this type of stuff that I like to write essays about music, because music is the most important. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I live. I mean, last night I saw Pulp at the Palladium, and Pulp came out in 1978. Nice. They've been around for a long time. They certainly, I don't think they would check the post-punk box. They check the Brit pop box, but they are kind of post-punky. And I was thinking about our discussion today when I was watching them, and I was looking at them going, I can't believe these guys were formed in 1978. It's amazing. I mean, they sound even better now than they did previously. And there's so many great bands, so many great post-punk bands that are out on tour and they're kicking ass. And so if you like this music, if you want to learn more about it, everybody should buy these books and go out and see these bands, because that's where these bands make a lot of their money, is out on the tour. From what I understand from my musicians friends, it's really hard to make money these days. And so the fact that Selena Gomez is worth $1 billion, once again, God bless her. I hope she does some good with that money.
So this is just a little personal anecdote. You know, and I don't think I've actually talked with Richard about this. Whenever I do one of these pop culture and philosophy books, I kind of, in my mind, I put it into one or two categories. The first category is like, oh, that would be a fun book to do and a fun little project, and we can do something really cool for the fans. It'll be good. The second category, though, is like, you know, maybe I'm puffing myself up a little bit, but I genuinely feel like I'm fortunate enough to like be making this contribution to philosophy or the world, or right. And these music genre books, like the punk book and the punk post-punk book, yeah, some of my proudest work, just because I do feel like these things are culturally significant and philosophers should take a crack at them. And the fact that we get to be a part of that is, I feel really good.
Amen. We're lucky to have you guys. We're lucky to have you guys. I'm serious.
We feel equally lucky to. Yes, I think my fourth time on this show. It's been nice for my books. I always enjoy the conversation. You two are fantastic hosts, right? So we get nicely into the issues. I have a podcast. We're a little bit on hiatus. But whenever I'm on your show, I always think, man, I don't ask questions that good. I gotta pay more attention to what you do and
oh my gosh, that is a huge compliment. Thank you.
Well, these are really good for us, and the conversations have always been just loads of fun.
And I'll piggyback on that. Like, we've also done, they can be a drag, like just because so these are very great.
I have a question, if you don't mind. It's slightly out of scope of the book, but I'm curious. So when we're talking about the boundaries of the genres that are not part of punk rock, but I'm wondering if punk rock has impacted these genres. So something like hip hop that turned 50 or country music, do you see any kind of thread between punk rock and these genres that are completely different? And the reason I'm asking is because Beyonce's latest album that she dropped in the spring, there was a song on there called Spaghetti that I've listened to a million times. And it's because it starts out saying how genres are a funny little concept. And then as you listen to the song, you've got rap, you've got a bit of classical, and then you've got country. And it was fascinating how she used that track to interlace these different genres to come up with a very, very cool song. So it got me thinking about the impact of punk rock potentially in these radically different genres.
Yeah, I can speak to the country. I don't listen to a lot of hip hop, although I don't dislike it. You know, there's a bunch of sort of early 80s punk bands got into what was called the cowpunk movement, Beat Farmers and bands like this. People that had punk sensibilities, but also kind of really liked a Johnny Cash sort of twang, or maybe the Bakersfield sound. And then that, in combination with alt country, created a kind of a sizable part of, not percentage wise, but just plenty of activity going on in the country circles, right? And so, you know, alt country, I think, still survives quite a bit today. So punk has definitely influenced at least the fringes of country music.
And there's a connection here to post-punk because, you know, it would be an overstatement to say that post-punk was the first time that people like started breaking down barriers of genres, because, right, the very invention of rock and roll was sort of a meshing of genres. But it did seem to feel kind of like a bellwether moment when people started to think, you know, why can't we just sort of throw these things together and, have synths and guitar and we do all this different weird stuff and, be eclectic. And the legacy of that is still showing up today, that what matters is the end product. And if you can get something great by meshing up two different subgenres, all the better.
Thank you. Rudy, did you have any more questions?
I just wanted to recognize that you guys do really great work. We have to ask, what's the next one? you guys
Oh,
were
are you
working
doing
on.
one on Back to the Future? Was that it? Or
Yes, we are.
Yeah, that one's about done. It's in the editorial process.
We're working with a new publisher, a publisher we haven't worked with before, and their process to get it to market is a little longer than what we're used to. So I would imagine that will come out sometime in like fall of 25, but somewhere in there. And then the other one that we're working at that is relevant to this, we're still like kind of in the early stages. We're doing 90s alternative and philosophy.
Oh.
Oh, that's great. That's
So
going
we're-
to be a really good one. That one, maybe you will bring up pulp and the Britpop bands. I'm sure that's going to be at least probably that'll probably have like a whole chapter with a number of essays on it, I imagine.
Right, and that might be a better place for a discussion of My Chemical Romance, for example.
Sure, right, yeah.
Yeah.
All the legacy bands that came sort of after the 90s. Yeah, so we're still in the very early stages where we're still receiving submissions, but relative to some of the other books we've done, we're at a good start. We've got a lot of good submissions, even though the deadline is still 2 months away. So we imagine this one's going to turn out really good too. We're excited.
You guys are creating a pop culture empire. I love it. I mean, it's fantastic.
Do you find any kind of snobbery in the philosophy academic community with putting this together?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Man.
Tons of that. I mean, from the very first one I did, I got an anonymous email from somebody, and I knew what school they were at because it had the name of the school somewhere in the thing. It's like, why do you do this garbage? I mean, there's pedigree stuff, and the discipline's changing. I've been doing pop culture and philosophy stuff for 25 years or so. A couple years ago, David Chalmers came out with a bunch of work saying, look, you can analyze the matrix for epistemology. And I'm thinking that there were 2 books on that 15 years earlier. But I see less snobbery all the time, but sure.
So like the first couple of books came out, I think in like 99, 2000. So it's now been a quarter of a century. And if you look back, there's literally hundreds of these books now. And if you look back at the wide breadth of people who have written at least one essay for these books, a lot of them with plenty of prestige of their own. It's like everybody, you can be a snob as much as you want until like your thing gets a book. And then you're going to, oh, okay, well that one's okay. That one, right. And so it's almost, if somebody is a little snobbish about it now, I'm like, that's outdated. You are wrong. Like this is such a mainstream thing now that like, yes, we should be doing this, and this is good work. So yeah, you can have your snobbery all you want. I'm totally
Philosophy is for everybody. And Josh, how dare you remind me that 2000 was a quarter of a century ago?
Oh my goodness,
Josh, I was having a good Friday. Come on, what are you doing here?
The whole point of us doing this podcast is for me to understand philosophy. I'm not even the common man. I'm the dumb man.
Whatever.
And I'm trying to make philosophy
Georgetown
more relatable and approachable, and how to live a better life through philosophy. We are not snobs. We are not overly academic. We are not talking about philosophy at some like super high level discussion of it where it's like really pointless. We are not those people. That is not this podcast. This is for everybody. And that's why we love that you guys put out these books. You're actually educating people. And we thank you for
Thank
that.
you, Richard and Josh. Always a joy. Always just such a pleasure.
Much appreciated.
absolutely.
Good is in the Details is produced by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske and Rudy Salo. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please scroll down to the bottom and hit that 5-star review. You can also check us out on Instagram, Good is in the Details Pod. And we'd like to give a shout out to our partner for this episode, Studio Queen Hair. Are you looking for a way to add volume, length, and shine to your hair? Welcome to Studio Queen Hair, the leader in hair extensions in America. Studio Queen Hair specializes in premium Slavic hair known for its natural look, softness, and durability. The founder of the studio, Anastasia Love, has been transforming women's hair for over 20 years using expert keratin microcapsules techniques. In this studio, every stylist of the team create personalized solutions for each client. Experience the highest quality and comfort with Studio Queen Hair, your secret to beautiful hair. Go to studioqueenhair.com. You can also check this out in the show notes. And if you would like extra content, join our book club. You can go to patreon.com/goodisinthedetails. We've also got an online course if you want to start your own podcast. I will link that in the show notes of how you can learn all there is to know about getting your idea into a successful podcast. Okay, until next time, bye.